first. Last 5 years, you've been on a little later on. Okay? What are you going to do instead? Which then points us back to arguments like
you're going to be living on the gravy train.
It's similar to a national basic income.
And maybe how you sort of,
I'm guessing, say, disability payments.
The same law, let's say in the Washington state, every city has its own.
Or current social benefits, what?
Library for hosting us and
position. And they tend to see a UBI existing alongside Medicare and okay? Not necessarily.
tonight's event. My name is Cindy Scharschmidt and I serve as board president of the World Affairs Council of Tacoma. I'm really excited to hear from our speaker this evening, Peter Grosvenor, who is professor, am I pronouncing his last name correctly?
Grosvenor.
Grosvenor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter Grosvenor, who is faculty at Pacific Lutheran University and who will be talking about universal basic income. We're
That's
so
right.
excited to hear more. If this is your first time at a World Affairs Council of Tacoma event, welcome. Please refer to our website for upcoming speaker series events. And if you're a long-time member or attendee, wonderful to have you back. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this evening on a dark November night. And the title I've given this talk is Universal Basic Income, an old idea whose time has come, question mark. And the first thing I've got to do is apologize for the unoriginality of that title, because if you go online, you'll find articles and talks on UBI which all say, is this an old idea whose time has come? That's the way that it's being spoken about these days. Can I just have a show of hands? How many of you have actually heard of a universal basic income? That's very nearly all of you. Now, if I'd asked that question 10 years ago, far fewer hands would have gone up. So this is becoming part of the conversation about social and economic policy here in the United States and around the world. Now, I am a convert to a universal basic income, having previously been opposed to it. But I'm not here to win converts this evening. So what I've got to do this evening, I think, is four things. First of all, I want to explain what a universal basic income is. Then I want to set out the major arguments for it, okay? And then I want to set out the arguments against it, okay? And then I want to look at some universal basic income experiments that have been run around the world in recent years, including here in Tacoma, okay? So, let's start then with a definition. What is a universal basic income, which I'll be calling a UBI from now on? Okay. Well, to explain it, I think I'm just going to break it down into its three parts: universal, basic, and income. Okay. So let's start with universal. What is universal about a UBI is it is paid to everybody. It is not targeted to specific groups. And there are no eligibility criteria except citizenship. Okay? Let's contrast this with, let's say, workfare, which requires people on benefits to undertake some public service work in order to get benefits. Or let's compare it with disability benefits, which require periodic health assessments. Okay? A UBI, we can think of it as a right, like the right to vote. Okay? I would get it, you would get it, people currently in the welfare system would get it, Bill Gates would get it, okay? It is genuinely universal. It would be paid to all citizens over the age of 18. So let's go from universal to basic. What is basic about it is that a UBI is intended to cover essential living costs. A UBI, at a minimum, would cover the fundamentals of food and accommodation. The essential point is that nobody, regardless of their circumstances, should ever be without those. Okay? So most UBI advocates argue for a monthly payment in the range of $1,000 to $1,500. Okay? So just imagine every month you would get $1,000 or $1,500 deposited in your bank account. And then we come to the third element, income. Okay? It's a regular payment, usually thought of in terms of months, okay? With absolutely no restrictions regarding how it is spent. There's no conditions imposed on what you can spend it on. Let's contrast this with, say, food stamps, which can only be spent on food. So, to pull all of that together, a universal basic income is a recurring cash payment made unconditionally to all adult citizens, regardless of their current or their past employment status. Okay? Now, I'm going to have plenty of time for questions at the end, I hope, but I'm going to guess that the first question that will come up, so I might as well answer it now, is how is all of this going to be paid for? Okay? First question everybody always asks about a UBI. Okay. Well, a UBI will be financed in two ways. The first thing we need to point out is that a UBI would replace some or even all of the existing welfare system. So it wouldn't simply be adding to existing government expenditure. It would be folded into money that the government is spending already. So that immediately brings down what you might imagine to be astronomical costs of doing this. Okay? But anybody who wants to advocate for a UBI is also going to have to accept that it's going to involve increased taxes. Okay? Now those taxes could come in the form of progressive income taxes, where higher earners pay more. It could come in the form of wealth taxes. It could come in the form of consumption taxes. You could place taxes on things that you may not want people to consume, and you could use those taxes as a deterrent. It could be paid for perhaps with carbon taxes, as we're trying to decarbonize the economy. And one particularly fruitful avenue we could explore is financial transaction costs, or taxes, okay? So financial transactions go on all the time, and this has been proposed by a number of leading economists that taxing financial transactions would be a major source of government revenue. Now, I began by saying that a UBI is a very old idea. The oldest source that I can find for somebody talking about a UBI comes from Sir Thomas More in the reign of Henry VIII in his 1516 book, Utopia. And another early proponent of a UBI was a name that will be familiar to all of you, Thomas Paine, the Englishman who played such a prominent role in both the American and French revolutions. And he argued for a basic income in his 1795 book, Agrarian Justice. But More and Paine, of course, were writing before the Industrial Revolution. And the social problems that were created by the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century led to the growth of the modern welfare state in the first half of the 20th century. Now, that welfare state did much to improve social conditions, but it came with two fundamental problems that are still with us. Okay? First of all, there is the problem of stigma. There has always been a social stigma to being on welfare, and I think that is especially true here in the United States. Okay? And secondly, it comes with the problem of the poverty trap. The welfare system can provide disincentives to move from welfare to work, because a small increase in income by, for example, taking a part-time job can see the rapid withdrawal of benefits. So someone could actually be making themselves financially worse off by trying to get themselves back into the labour market. Now, a UBI has emerged as a possible solution to both of those problems. This gained momentum during the Great Society program here in the United States, President Johnson's Great Society program, which had those problems of stigma and the poverty trap. And one of the first people to suggest UBI as an alternative to it was Dr. Martin Luther King, who in 1968 formed the Poor People's Campaign, which produced an economic Bill of Rights, and a UBI was part of that bill. At about the same time, a very different character, Professor Milton Friedman, the free market economist and winner of the 1976 Nobel Prize for Economics, proposed the idea of a negative income tax. This is a very intriguing idea. It's not quite a UBI, but embodies some of the similar principles. What happens with a negative income tax is that the government would set a minimum income. People earning above that income would then start to pay taxes, but people falling below that income would receive a payment from the state. Okay? It's a basic income, but it's not universal, because it's only paid to those people whose income falls below a set level, whereas a UBI is paid to everybody. Another character who picks up the idea of this, the UBI, in 1969, President Richard Nixon. President Richard Nixon. He produced something approximating a UBI with his family assistance plan. What this would have done would be to provide a minimum income, but like the negative income tax, it was not universal. Nixon was proposing something that only applied to people with children, and it came with work requirements, that if you didn't accept job offers, then you would suffer financial penalties. But the family assistance plan actually passed the House of Representatives, but was voted down in the Senate in 1971. So the United States came fairly close in the early 1970s to implementing something that's fairly close to a UBI. Okay? So who supports UBI today? Well, support for UBI has grown across the globe, and also significantly across the political spectrum. Okay? So let's take a look at some prominent people today who argue for a UBI. Mark Zuckerberg, okay, the Facebook founder. Elon Musk, the Tesla CEO and the world's richest man. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Geoffrey Hinton, the cognitive scientist who's thought of as the early pioneer of artificial intelligence. Sam Altman, who is behind ChatGPT. Okay? A lot of tech bros there for reasons I'll come back to a little later on. Okay? Andrew Yang, the businessman and a former Democratic Party presidential hopeful, is in favor of UBI. Perhaps a less familiar name to you. Yanis Varoufakis, the Marxist finance minister of Greece in the 2010s. Then there is a man called Yong Hae-in, who is a South Korean economist, and he leads his country's basic income party. There's actually a South Korean political party devoted to bringing about a basic income. Amartya Sen, the social democratic Indian economist and Nobel laureate. Charles Murray, a controversial character, an American political scientist, and a libertarian, okay? Very different part of the political spectrum from the others I've mentioned. Robert Reich, who was Labour Secretary in President Clinton's first administration, and Andy Stern, who was leader of the Service Employees International Union. And then, of course, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the anti-apartheid campaigner and Nobel Peace Prize winner. So you can see from that list, it's quite a lengthy list, and it could have been longer. Okay? But what you can see from that list is that support for a UBI doesn't tell you anything necessarily about a person's politics. They may have all sorts of other beliefs as well, but it really is growing across the political spectrum. Now, I think we need to try and explain why there's been this growth in support for a UBI. I can even call it an explosion of support for a UBI. And I think there are two factors that explain it. The first is the 2008 Great Crash and the Great Recession that came after it, which resulted in increased economic insecurity. So here in the United States, Senator Bernie Sanders, who does not support a UBI, okay, frequently uses the statistic that 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and they couldn't withstand a $1,000 external shock, such as, say, a medical bill or an auto repair bill. This can be greatly destabilizing to the finances of 60% of Americans. When I'm back at home in the United Kingdom, it's very hard for me to explain that the United States is a very wealthy country, but Americans are not. Okay? It's a distinction that a lot of people outside of America fail to see. Now, the legacy of the 2008 crash continues to shape the economic prospects of the young people that I teach, which is why so many of my students are very interested in the idea of a UBI. A second factor that I think explains why there's been a growth in support for UBI is the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all remember far too well. Okay? The stimulus checks sent out by the Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration function, in effect, as a one-time basic income. So whether you've thought about it or not, it's entirely likely that within the last 5 years, you've been on a basic income. Okay? So I think those two things together, the Great Crash and the pandemic, have contributed a great deal to growing interest in the UBI. So let's look at the principal arguments for it. Okay? And I'm going to start with, and this argument interests me a very great deal, start with the phenomenon of unpaid labor. Okay? There's now a much better understanding of how reliant society is on a vast amount of unpaid labor. So in official labor statistics, work that isn't paid is not counted as work at all. So a woman, and it usually is a woman, who stays at home to raise her own child is deemed to be not working. Okay. Yes, I thought that would get a reaction. Yeah. But if a woman were to take a job as a childminder to raise somebody else's child, she would be deemed to be working. But in the real world, of course, the amount of labor going on there is exactly the same. Okay? The most common form of unpaid work is care work of one kind or another, raising children, caring for the elderly, caring for sick relatives, and so on. And this is work that is done disproportionately by women who frequently have to combine those tasks with paid work. Okay? And I think that's why it is women's groups who have been at the forefront of campaigns to expose just how much unpaid labor there is in the economy. That labor is indispensable to society. It has to be done, but it is unremunerated. So a UBI is looked at as a means of recognizing unpaid work, okay, and making unpaid work a more viable option for people to take. Okay, so that's the first argument. The second argument, and this is I hate neologisms, I hate made-up words, and the English language is a very rich one. I don't know why economists do this, but we have to talk about this thing called precarity. Precarity. Now, you might know that Karl Marx used the term proletariat to describe the working class. Well, a few years ago, a British economist called Guy Standing coined the term precariat to describe the growing number of workers who are in precarious work. This is work that is uncertain and insecure, can disappear at any time. The amount of precarity in the economy has increased greatly because of globalization, because of technological change, because of labor market deregulation, and because of the decline of labor unions. Okay, so there's a lot more precarious work in the economy than there has been previously. People in precarious jobs find it very difficult to make financial plans or to secure loans. So it makes life very difficult and very difficult to make progress. So a UBI, it is argued, would provide the precariat with stability and continuity that's otherwise unattainable to them. There would always be that monthly check, even if that precarious job went away. Okay? Thirdly, and I love this part as well, I just love this part, the phenomenon of unproductive work. Not all paid work is productive. I think an extreme example of this is the case of the elevator greeter in the former Soviet Union. In the 1980s, I made 2 trips to Moscow, and on every floor of a Russian hotel, there would be somebody sitting behind a desk facing the elevator, and their job was to say hello to guests as the elevator doors opened. Okay? Now, this was, of course, a form of disguised unemployment. That's what that was. Okay? It enabled the state to claim that there was full employment, even if it was paying people to effectively do nothing. Okay? Now, before we dismiss that as yet another inefficiency of a failing communist economy, let's not forget the Walmart greeters of today. Right? This might not be so unfamiliar an idea to us after all. Now, a recent poll by the British polling firm YouGov, a very reputable firm, found that 37% of British workers believed that their jobs did not make a meaningful contribution to the world. Okay? A UBI would empower people to leave jobs that they believed to be pointless and to seek out more fulfilling work. Then fourthly, and now we're into some controversial material here, a fourth argument for UBI is the debate over free trade. Okay? There is this ongoing debate between free trade and protectionism, which is basically a debate about whether domestic industries should be exposed to foreign competition or whether they should be protected from it by tariffs. Now, in the 1990s, when I moved to the United States, there was a major shift towards free trade with the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. Okay? But only 4 years later, 1999, there were mass protests at the World Trade Organization's first ministerial conference in Seattle. This became known as the Battle of Seattle, and some of you will remember it. And now, under President Trump, America has returned to a regime of protectionist tariffs. So free trade versus protectionism is an incredibly heated debate here in America. And I think that that's for one very clear reason. And that reason is the weakness of the American social safety net. If you tell an American worker that foreign competition might lead to the loss of his or her job, then he or she will likely come out against free trade. That's because losing your job in America can be catastrophic. Okay? Not only does it lead to a loss of income and the threat of poverty, but also to the loss of health insurance, okay? And it may even result in homelessness. Okay? Now, you could say that America has got unemployment insurance, but this is a vastly complicated scheme for anybody who's ever been on it, okay? With a very intimidating application process and eligibility criteria that varies greatly between states. And in most states, benefits only run for 26 weeks. Regardless of what circumstances you're in 26 weeks, it's cut off, and then you're on your own. Now, it is argued that a basic income would provide the safety net that could sustain an unemployed worker as he or she looks for another job. And that would take so much of the heat out of the free trade versus protectionism debate. Okay? But fifthly, a fifth reason why there's been a growth of interest in UBI is, I think, the most important one. And that is the technological displacement of labor. Okay? Far and away, the most significant factor in explaining the growth and support for UBI is technology. So in the period 2000 to 2017, 85% of American manufacturing jobs that were lost to technology, while only 13% were lost to foreign competition. Okay? So, to go back to what I was talking about earlier on, it's no accident that Silicon Valley is the home to some of UBI's most vocal supporters, because the tech bros are the ones with the greatest understanding of the job-destroying potential of artificial intelligence, or AI. Okay? We're already seeing this in transport with the rise of driverless trains, trucks, and taxis. But it won't stop there. In the 1990s, again when I arrived in this country, and again to come and work in higher education in America, higher education was being heavily promoted as a passport to higher value-added white-collar jobs that were beyond the reach of automation. Okay? But as we enter the AI revolution, those white-collar graduate jobs are also now at risk. This is particularly true of data entry. Okay? We have some young people here, don't consider data entry as a career. It's not going to work, okay? Telemarketing, don't go there either, okay? Bookkeeping, no. Customer service, no. So Dario Amodi, the founder of an AI company called Anthropic, has predicted that half of the entry-level white-collar jobs in America will be eliminated within the next 5 years. Yeah. AI is also likely to displace workers in content creation, such as research, journalism, and even creative writing. You might remember that in 2023, there was a 5-week strike by members of the Writers Guild of America over the use of AI in script writing. Okay? Or consider me. Okay? I've spent half my life in school, and I've got a string of letters after my name. But when you go home this evening, you could ask ChatGPT to tell you the arguments for and against the UBI, and you might very well find out it's done a better job than me. Okay? Which raises the question of whether we're going to need people in corduroy jackets with elbow pads teaching in college 10 years from now. I mean, it's not entirely clear that we will. So we are certainly on the eve of a major technological transformation of society and the economy. And supporters of UBI claim that a UBI will be needed to provide security and stability as we go through that turbulent change. So those are, I think, the principal arguments for a UBI. So let's turn now to the case against it. UBI advocates claim that it will solve a lot of problems in whole or in part, but there are serious arguments against it. And like its supporters, opponents of UBI can be found all over the world and all over the political spectrum. Okay. In a nutshell, the opponents of UBI say that it's too expensive, it will make people lazy, and it will cause inflation. Those are the three big arguments that you hear. So let's take a look at those arguments. I'll start firstly then with costs. Many economists deny that a UBI could be funded by eliminating all, or at least many, existing welfare programs. A national UBI would add trillions to government annual spending that would have to be funded by significant tax increases or an increase in the national debt. And attempts to fund a UBI through taxes on the super rich would run into the problem that the super rich are very mobile and could simply locate to tax havens. A left-wing British economist called Luke Martinelli is opposed to UBI because, as he puts it, and I'm quoting him, an affordable UBI is inadequate, and an adequate UBI is unaffordable. Okay. Secondly, second argument against it is the inflation argument. If a UBI increased demand in the economy without a corresponding increase in the supply of goods and services, then prices would necessarily go up. And inflation, as you all noticed, has now become a major part of the economic conversation again, for two reasons. Basically, it's been argued that the stimulus checks in COVID were excessive and drove inflation. And then, of course, there was also Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which drove up energy prices and therefore the price of anything that needs to be transported. Okay? So now voters and consumers are understandably concerned about any measure that could potentially drive up inflation. A third argument against UBI is what I'm going to call the misallocation of resources. Many opponents of UBI say the big problem with the universal basic income is its universality. That's the problem, okay? In place of a UBI, they argue for targeted welfare, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or what we used to call food stamps, or housing assistance. These forms of welfare go to those most in need and concentrate social spending on those most in need. They also argue that universality doesn't recognize specific needs, and this, I think, is an important part of their case. So, the basic cost of living may be much higher for people with serious disabilities, for example. Okay? So the UBI would then have to be supplemented with disability benefits. Now, if you do that, not only does it drive up costs, but it also takes us back to the administrative complexity that UBI was intended to get us away from. Okay? So it's a serious argument that's worth thinking about. Then, incentives. It's the next part of the opponent's case. And this is an argument I hear a lot in America. What would UBI do to incentives? So the question basically is, if you break the link between working and income, why would anybody go to work? That's the question. Why would anybody go to work if there's a universal basic income? Well, supporters of UBI would answer that a UBI only covers basic needs. It'll keep a roof over your head and food on the table. But people will always want a better roof. They would want better food. And they will want consumer goods, such as cars and smartphones and smart TVs and vacations and so on. And so the incentive to work would remain. But nobody can deny that a UBI would have a significant impact on incentives. In particular, it would sharply reduce incentives to do low-paying jobs or unproductive jobs, which would either go undone or would have to be paid at a much higher rate to get people to do them. Okay. Another argument against the UBI, that it would subsidize problem behavior. Okay. Some opponents of the UBI argue that it would subsidize problem behavior such as behaviors relating to alcoholism or drug use. Okay. And similarly, it would take away incentives to be a smart financial manager of your own affairs, because there's always a safety net. So it could involve reckless financial decision-making. Another very important argument against UBI is the existence of alternatives. It would be completely wrong to suggest that opponents of UBI are not concerned with those problems that UBI advocates are trying to solve. They are concerned about them. But they point to alternatives that might, in their view, be more effective in tackling poverty and providing financial security. So these alternatives can be living wage legislation, okay? Or strong trade unions, or one that interests me a lot, the Danish flexicurity system, which might be unfamiliar to you. The Danish flexicurity system is pretty amazing. If you lose your job in Denmark, the state pays something like 2/3 of your salary until you find another one. Okay? So Danish people are not at all worried about losing jobs. The labor market is very fluid. Okay? Then there is the idea that Senator Sanders puts forward instead of a UBI, and that is a job guarantee. Instead of guaranteeing an income, you guarantee a job. Okay? Something else that Bernie Sanders has advocated, and in this he is joined by Bill Gates, is you could have a robot tax. You tax robots, which would reduce the incentive to lay workers off by automating their jobs. So taxing robots. And then, of course, there's an emphasis on guaranteed social services, providing things like single-payer healthcare and affordable housing. These are put forward as alternatives to a basic income. And then, lastly, there are the political obstacles. It's often suggested that UBI will never get off the ground because the public won't accept the idea of something for nothing, especially here in the United States. Well, what I'm going to wrap up with very, very quickly now is a look at some UBI experiments that have been run around the world, so we can look at these arguments for and against in practice. And come back to that argument that this would never get off the ground, especially here in the United States. Well, probably the most studied example of a UBI that we have so far comes from the United States. In fact, it comes from Alaska. Okay? In 1982, the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend was established, and it makes an annual payment to all state residents, and it is funded by the state government's share of Alaska's oil and gas revenues, and it's paid unconditionally to all Alaskans who meet the residency requirement of 1 year's continuous residence. In 2022, it was paid at the rate of $3,000 a year. In 2025, currently, it is down to $1,000 a year. Now, it's not strictly a UBI because it doesn't cover the basics. Okay? It's not high enough to qualify as a UBI in the strictest sense. But it has been subject to numerous studies, all of which conclude that it has been effective in reducing poverty in Alaska and without any detrimental effects on the Alaskan labor market. In fact, Hillary Clinton has written that when she ran for president in 2016, she contemplated putting a UBI in her campaign, and she was going to call it Alaska for America. Then there's an experiment that interests me enormously going on in Kenya. Kenya doesn't have a national basic income scheme, but an international non-profit organization called Give Directly, which is an amazing organization, has been operating a UBI pilot scheme in Kenya since 2018. Most international development aid takes the form of disaster relief or food aid or technology transfers. But what Give Directly are doing is giving unconditional cash payments to 200 rural communities. And they intend to run this experiment for 12 years. Okay? And the preliminary results show that hunger has been reduced, infant mortality has been reduced, public health in general has been improved, and entrepreneur schemes have been launched. And then there is Finland, the European country, wealthy European country, that did a 2-year experiment from 2018 to 2020, where 2,000 recipients of unemployment benefit were randomly selected and given a monthly tax-free payment of 560 euros. The results of this study were mixed. There was only a slight increase in the numbers moving into work, but there were major benefits in terms of improved mental health and behavioral issues. And then finally, and I'll finish with this one, Tacoma. Tacoma has run its own UBI experiment. Its official name is GRIT, Growing Resilience in Tacoma. And it was run jointly by the City of Tacoma and United Way of Pierce County, with research provided by the University of Pennsylvania. Now, GRIT 1.0 ran from 2021 to 2022. Unlike the Finnish experiment, the selected participants were 110 single-parent families from what we call ALICE families. I don't know if that's familiar to you. ALICE basically means asset limited, income constrained, employed. Okay? So these are people with limited assets, limited income, though they are in work. And all of the participants received $500 a month for the year. And again, there was a control group of single-parent ALICE families who did not receive the payment to compare them with. And the findings have been generally positive. The cash was for the most part spent on necessities. Participants were able to pay down debt. Participants were also able to leave second jobs that were placing immense strain on families. And again, mental health improved. There is currently a GRIT 2.0 launched in April 2024, and that is still ongoing. So what I've tried to do is to define a UBI, to look at the arguments for and against it, and to give you a thumbnail sketch of how it's been translated into practice. Now I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Yes?
Yeah, 2 questions. Given how expensive this would be, why wouldn't you means test it? $1,000 a month is a rounding error to Bill Gates, but it could be a lifeline to an Alice. That's number 1. And number 2, you talked about the average payment being $1,000 to $1,500 a month. In Tacoma, a studio costs $1,500 a month. It's not like you're going to be living on the gravy train. It's hard to imagine that this would allow people to seek a brave new world of all sorts of different kinds of employment, because one medical mishap, one car crash, and you're hosed.
Yeah. Well, you're hosed now, of course, without that.
Right.
Without that. You'd be less hosed with it, would be one answer to that. But to come back to your first question, why not means test it? Well, that would mean its universality just goes out of the window. Then you bring back stigma. Some people are getting it, some people are not. Okay, and why are you on it and why are you not off it? And also, means-tested benefits, and I think this isn't fully understood, tend to be very expensive to administer. You need an army of people who are looking in great detail at people's financial circumstances to see if they qualify or not. So the savings of making something means tested are frequently exaggerated. Okay? But I do take your point about $1,500 a month here in Tacoma is not fully covering the basics. That is certainly true. That is certainly true. Yes?
Sorry if you covered this already, but what's the age at which these payments would be made? I mean, would a family get money for a 5-year-old, for example?
No. In that a universal basic income is paid to all adult citizens unconditionally. So if there are 2 adults in the house, there are 2 basic incomes going in, and so on. Okay. So I should point out, by the way, that there are universal basic income schemes, plural. Okay. So you could have eligibility beginning at 16 or beginning at 18. There are all sorts of, in some schemes, UBIs are taxed, in others not. Okay, so there's a plurality of these systems. Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify, when you say universal,
Yeah.
are you meaning national or just universal? Like, I might be behind on that, and then I'll have a follow-up.
Okay. There is no country in the world that has introduced a national UBI scheme. Okay. So all of the UBI experiments that we've had have been within defined jurisdictions, like, for example, the 200 villages, specific villages in Kenya, or the city of Tacoma. Okay. So they're universal within the jurisdiction. That's what. Does that clear that up for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then follow up to that.
Yeah.
In regards to a large-scale project,
Yeah.
like something similar to a national basic income, how would you respond to raising inflation rates and how that corresponds to, say, like trade unilateralism or, global relations?
The inflation argument is a very important one. So I said that if the UBI drives up demand in the economy, but we don't produce more goods and services, then that's going to drive up inflation. But I think UBI advocates will say, well, why wouldn't it drive up the production of more goods and services because of that more demand? So let's take this example. Let's say you want to buy a sofa for $1,000, okay? And you've got your UBI that's going to pay for it. Your month's UBI is going to pay for it. But 4 other people want to buy that sofa. Now you've got 4 people with the same money going to buy the same sofa. The supplier is going to put up the cost of the sofa. Or produce more sofas. Okay? So if it stimulates more production, it wouldn't be inflationary. Does that make sense? Yeah. Basically, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So if there's more money in the economy, and it stimulates more production to produce those goods, then the inflationary risk is cancelled out.
I think what I'm mostly getting at is who's going to produce those goods.
Who's going to produce the goods? Yeah. Producers who are responding to the fact that there's more money out there now. Okay? And they'll want you to spend it with that. That makes sense? Yes?
I was really intrigued by your it was more of a side comment in your speech about Friedman's negative income tax. Yeah, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that idea entails and maybe how it how it was received. Did it go anywhere besides Friedman? It's sort of an intriguing idea.
The idea is still very much alive, but it's not in implementation. But that has been part of the conversation about fiscal policy for a very long time. And one of the things that I find useful about talking about a UBI, if I go along and say, I'm in favor of UBI, I want everybody to have a UBI. And people say, all of these problems associated with it. I said, well, okay, then what are you going to do instead? Which then points us back to arguments like the negative income tax. It points us to things like the Danish flex security system. And it actually generates a very creative debate. So even if people don't actually end up supporting a UBI, in just arguing with the UBI means they start thinking outside of the box, and it makes for a much more creative conversation about how to tackle poverty and inequality, I think. Mike?
When you said the word universal, does this meaning of universal may change from district to district, city to city, state to state? Because, we don't have the same law. Let's say in the Washington state, every city has its own law, taxation, whatever. Will that universal amount, it's universal across every state, every district?
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the question for the back? She would have been hard to hear.
Okay, sorry. Do I repeat the question? The question is about universality, and what Mariam is asking is, can you imagine this across the United States, for example? Well, I think the smaller the jurisdiction that it's implemented in, the easier it becomes to run this. The bigger the jurisdiction, you then get huge disparities about what constitutes basic living costs. Okay? So a UBI for New York City is going to be very different from a UBI from a small town in Alabama. So I am not envisioning that the United States government is going to introduce at any point in the future a nationwide UBI. So if UBI is going to be part of the conversation going forward, and I think it already is, it's going to be in much more local jurisdictions.
Can be the statewide or a district-wide, okay.
Absolutely.
Like that. Something
Yes.
like that, okay.
Yeah.
How?
Yes, this is a question for 1980s Peter Grosvenor. And so why were you against UBI in the 1980s? And what would 2025 Peter Grosvenor say to 1980s?
Back in the 1980s, I was a full-time trade union official. I was a researcher for the unions. And when we were confronted with the idea of UBI, pushed back by defending the things that we were already working for. So we were campaigning for minimum wage. We were campaigning for a living wage. We were campaigning for stronger unionization. Okay? And I think I was right to be doing those things in the 1980s. I am swayed very much by two things. The massive decline in trade unions. Okay? So the trade union density in the United States, that's the proportion of the workforce who are actually in labor unions, is down to about 10% in America. Even if you doubled it, I'm not sure the trade unions can have a massive impact on living standards in America. So the fact that unions have gone into serious decline forced me to rethink this. And then, of course, I am confronted, as we all are, by the coming technological revolution and its potential to destroy jobs. This is one of the big disagreements I have with Senator Sanders, who says he doesn't want a guaranteed income, he wants a guaranteed job. Well, if the robots are going to be doing the jobs, what jobs are you going to give to the displaced workers? What are they going to do? And where are they going to do it? You know? So I think that a guaranteed job could proliferate unproductive work of the kind that I've been talking about. So those two things, the decline of unions and the development of artificial intelligence, have made me rethink my position. Yes?
It seems the UBI would be over and above what is there already. For instance, a person getting, say, disability payments, they would still get that. Social Security would still, the UBI wouldn't sufficiently replace, unless it was a very big UBI.
It depends on what UBI advocates you are listening to. So I mentioned earlier on Charles Murray, who is a libertarian. And what Charles Murray wants to do is to give every American $15,000 a year, okay? And then everything else goes. Medicare goes, Medicaid goes, disability benefits goes, child benefit goes, right? And he sees that as the road to a much, much smaller state, much smaller government. He's a libertarian. He wants the government to play less and less of a role in our lives, and he wants to shrink government. And he thinks the UBI will do that. If we go into say, well, and I tried to talk about this earlier on, well, what about people with disabilities whose living costs are higher? Are you going to give them a supplement on their UBI? And I think most people who advocate UBIs would say yes. But then we have come to the chink in their armor, okay? Because now we're back to having to come up with very complex administrative means to decide who gets it and who doesn't get it, how long they can get it for, okay? So it's uncomfortable for UBI advocates to talk about supplementary benefits, but most of them have to. They recognize they have to. Charles Murray is very much out on his own there. Everybody, you've all got your $15,000 a year, now you're completely on your own, okay? All right? Do with it what you want.
Yeah. Go ahead, Beth, go ahead.
So I've just heard snippets of this, but with the shutdown and discussion of premiums for healthcare going up, there was something about Trump wanting to give everybody $2,000 for healthcare. Is that his version of the UBI?
Oh,
geez.
no.
Well.
That's from tariffs, kind of revenue from tariffs. No.
It is true that with his stimulus checks, okay, Donald Trump is something of a hero in the UBI debate. And I haven't heard that idea that you just described. But that's probably an ad hoc fixture to one single problem for a time limited period.
Sounds
no.
like Trump, doesn't it?
Yes, the president may change his mind. It has been done. Sorry, so your hand a minute ago. I didn't get to you.
No, I had the same question that he did.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Let's say there's a UBI, for example, in Washington State. Will that affect if the person wants to get like a loan, or affect the credit score, or affect qualifying for the loan for the kind of car, house, mortgage? Will that somehow play a negative? If you didn't hear the question at the back, so what Mariam is asking me is, if you have a UBI, what does this do for things like your credit rating and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Well, it's going to improve it, hasn't it?
Qualifying for loan, I don't know, you know.
It's basically got to improve it, hasn't it?
It should.
Yes.
It should.
Absolutely, yes.
So one of the beauties of the UBI is the lack of administrative cost. Are you aware of, are there rules of thumb about, for current social benefits, what percentage of those we pay in terms of administrative burden?
Oh, it's enormous, and it would vary greatly between the different kinds of benefits that you're talking about. But if you're going to means test, you have to have very detailed knowledge of the recipient's financial circumstances, and you have to go on monitoring it as well. And in fact, you then have to verify it as well. You have to check up on people, which is what makes the welfare system so incredibly intrusive in people's lives. But the point still stands that it's frequently suggested that you save money by means testing because you target it at only the people who need it. But identifying the people who need it is incredibly expensive.
But is that 5% of the benefits? Is that 40%? Are there rules of thumb?
Rules of thumb, no, because it would be very different between disability benefits and medical benefits and unemployment benefits. So I think it would be very difficult to come up with a figure that would work across all of those. But much higher than you think, probably. So my own estimation for, let's say, unemployment insurance, it's probably about 30% of expenditure is going on the administration there of it. Okay. Any other questions?
I don't agree with Charles Murray when he said $15,000 and call it a day.
Yeah.
A lot of people have meds that cost them that much a month. There are a lot of people for whom that is not even a possibility. So where do they figure into his scenario?
Yeah. They don't. They don't.
They can die.
Which is why most UBI advocates are a long way from Mr. Murray's position, and they tend to see a UBI existing alongside Medicare and okay, not necessarily alongside Medicaid. Perhaps you could debate that. That's basically because it's an income issue, and so I think that most UBI advocates will sort of recognize the need to retain some, at least, of the existing welfare state. Okay? But then they get this problem, well, you know, where are you going to find the money again?
That's nice.
Yeah.
Now we have in Tacoma, this program on a very small scale. Now, what is going to take to move that scale, make that scale wider?
I think that...
Can we keep that in the back?
Yeah, so if we're going to have this experiment in Tacoma, what would it take for UBI to spread wider? And I think the answer to that is going to be, depends on the results of studies. And then I think you might see more jurisdictions saying, well, we'll try that as well then. It will proliferate on the basis of results, I think. Or not proliferate on the basis of results, depending on what those results are.
But it seems like it says universal basic income, but it seems like universal here and universal there and universal in different little bunches.
Mm-hmm.
Ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's new to me.
Any more? Yes.
In regards to that inflationary principle.
That's still bothering you.
Bring it up again. How do you suspect, even just banks would respond, even locally, if there's a Tacoma universal basic income, how would Tacoma banks respond to that?
How would they be asked to respond? When would it become relevant to them, do you think?
When people take less loans or take out money because there's so much inflation.
Yeah, well, surely it would be a good thing if fewer people are having to go to the bank for a loan. I mean, whether a loan is a good thing or a bad thing is very circumstantial, isn't it? If you're borrowing money to buy a better home, good thing. If you're borrowing money because you need to borrow money to keep your head above water, that's a very negative thing. So we will want to see less bank lending for people trying to keep their heads above water.
I think that's a perfect place to end, I think. So I wanted to thank our speaker for a very engaging conversation. Thank you to the Wheelock Library for hosting us, and thank you to Tacoma Creates for helping to fund this program. And thanks all of you for being here and asking such great questions.
Yes.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elon Musk.